Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. On this episode, we're diving headfirst into Armenia, a nation that's decided it's time to change dance partners mid-party. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has just announced that Armenia will pursue EU membership, a move that has Moscow clutching its pearls and worrying that Brussels and Washington are in cahoots. Now, you may ask, how does a small landlocked country, whose economy is so intertwined with Russia that they practically share a joint bank account, suddenly decide to go for a complete identity makeover? Well, it turns out that some recent events have spurred Pashinyan to re-examine this relationship. So, let's get into it. Here is a look at our latest report to find out more.
The once tight partnership between Russia and Armenia is slowly unraveling. While the threads aren't pulling apart all at once, this political rope is fraying. For Armenia and its Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, the direction is clear.
Our goal today is to advance the state interests of Armenia and to be maximally focused on that issue.
The Prime Minister's words come after a question concerning whether Armenia would fully leave the CSTO, Russia's version of NATO. Armenia has been developing ties with the West recently. It has shown interest in deeper cooperation with the United States, for example, when it comes to military and politically. Yerevan has also shown interest in joining the European Union, or at least courting it. Just last year, Armenia received €270 million in grants from the EU to boost its economy.
We share the Armenian people's vision for the future. We want Armenia to take its place as a strong, independent nation at peace with its neighbors, connected to the region and the world.
Armenia's discontent with its former partners and rivals stems for the most part from its relations with Azerbaijan. After the latter had conquered the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region in a lightning-fast offensive in 2023, Armenia was flooded with ethnic Armenian refugees, which had an impact on the economy. Russian peacekeepers stationed in the region had not intervened. Moscow, which has had its hands full with the war in Ukraine, showed itself as unwilling to resolve the crisis, which prompted the Armenians to suspend their operations as part of the CSTO and look for new partnerships elsewhere.
And now, as always, it's time to examine the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. After Russia's less than stellar military support during Armenia's armed conflict with Azerbaijan and Moscow's head-scratching performance during the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Pashinyan figured that maybe it was time for a backup plan. But while Armenia might be flirting with the European Union, it's still deeply involved with Russia when it comes to trade, energy, and even re-exporting goods to skirt international sanctions. And while some might say that's a classic "if you can't beat them, join them" approach, the fact remains that the EU membership bid is a monumental departure from decades of reliance on Russia. Picture this: Armenia's trade with Russia made up a whopping 42% of its overall turnover for the first 3 quarters of 2024, while its trade with the European Union barely registered at little over 7%. You see, Armenia's cozy energy deals with Russia, both gas and nuclear power, are as old as time. Switching gears now might mean not only higher energy costs, but also, as Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexei Overchuk graciously warned, more expensive imports and even job losses. Opposition figures in Armenia, like oligarch Gagik Tsarukyan, are sounding the alarm about potential economic hardship, suggesting that this pivot might just leave Armenia shivering in the cold, both literally and figuratively. But Armenia's efforts at diversification are not limited to trade and energy. Since Russia has been lacking in military support, Pashinyan has focused on trying to recalibrate Armenia's entire foreign policy. The country even froze its membership in the Collective Security Treaty Organization, an unprecedented move to say the least. But on the other hand, consider that a Russian military base in Gyumri is set to be around for another 20 years. And then there is a cameo from the United States. Armenian Foreign Minister Ararat Mirzoyan and the now former Secretary of State Antony Blinken signed a strategic partnership charter last month, hinting at cooperation that includes civilian nuclear energy. Armenia must navigate the winds of economic dependency on Russia, while attempting to embrace the uncertain but alluring promise of the United States and the European Union. It is a move that might redefine its future, but one that comes with enormous risks. As Pashinyan wisely noted at the World Economic Forum in Davos, any deviation from balance can have chain-like consequences for regional stability. So, as Armenia contemplates this shift, we're left with a classic dilemma: stick with the devil you know, or gamble on the promise of a better deal. However, I'm sure we all know full well that no relationship is free of complications. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Rafi Elliott, political risk analyst, Armenian Mirror Spectator. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thanks for having me back on the show.
So Armenia has set out certain objectives it wants to achieve. It wants to achieve a realignment. It wants to get closer to the US and the European Union. But how quickly do you think this process can be accomplished?
How quickly? I mean, talking about timelines, first of all, you brought up two different issues. The EU integration and getting closer to the US are two separate timelines here. As far as joining the European Union, the next step for Armenia would be a referendum on membership, which needs the Armenian people to sign off on that being the direction for the country to take. Armenia currently is also a member of the Russia-led Eurasian Economic Union, which was designed as an alternative to the EU. And you may remember that the creation of this union is actually what indirectly led to the war in Ukraine. So Armenia would have to leave this economic union in order to join the EU because they're competing customs unions. So that would come with its own complications. And of course, the next step is for negotiations to begin with the EU, for Armenia to comply with every chapter in the acquis communautaire, which is the set of rules that guides the values of the European Union. And eventually, all 27 member states have to unanimously agree to an Armenian membership in the EU. So that timeline could be up to 10 years, really.
So for all practical purposes, it's a statement of intent, isn't it? I mean, we know that the European Union can take its sweet time when it comes to allowing countries to join, like some of the Balkan countries have been waiting for years, and they are still not part of the European Union. Now, before we move on to the question of alignment with the US, which, as you rightly mentioned, is quite separate from the European Union, do you think there is a risk that some members of society in Armenia may not want this change? In particular, we can take a glance at some of the businesses and oligarchs, and they already said if we leave the Eurasian Economic Union, this could be a problem for the economy. Prices could go up. Do you think that this could be the beginning of an opposition to Mr. Pashinyan's plans?
So that's a very important concern. I would say, based on the polling that has been coming out recently in Armenia, there is a widespread consensus amongst the Armenian population that EU membership would ideally be advantageous for Armenia. There are, of course, business interests that tie Armenia into the Eurasian Union, into the Russian markets in particular. Those tend to be in the hands of oligarchs who are tied to the previous regime in Armenia, and they have vested interest in continuing these relationships, both in terms of business interests, as you've mentioned correctly, but also political ties to their counterparts in Russia and in Belarus. However, for many other types of businesses, the argument could actually be made that Eurasian Union membership hasn't necessarily benefited Armenia. In fact, quite the opposite. It may have slowed down economic growth and diversification. So there are probably many others who are very much interested in gaining access to the European market. And the fact that Armenia actually back in 2012, 2013 turned its back on a free trade agreement with the EU is seen as a lost opportunity, because those last 10 years could have been spent preparing the Armenian agricultural and manufacturing sectors to meet EU import standards, which now Armenia has to get on. So there will be trade-offs. I think that's very clear. Armenia gets some very direct benefits from Eurasian Union membership, including, in theory, lower than market prices for gas. However, those don't necessarily outweigh the benefits of EU membership for a lot of people in Armenia. One last item to add that's probably important to the discussion here is that Armenia is also become strategically important for Russia very recently due to the war in Ukraine as an import partner, because Armenia is an EU member, Eurasian Union member, and Armenia still maintains trade networks with the West.
But this is, of course, a complicated relationship, Russia and Armenia, because we know that Armenia has been, well, facing disillusionment due to the fact that they expected Russia to help during the conflict with Azerbaijan. Russia didn't really do anything in this regard, which brings me to my next question. Do you think the European Union may require Armenia to make peace with Azerbaijan, and could this be a major hurdle? Because we know that the conflict goes a long way into the past, right? There are resentments. Some people are still angry at Nikol Pashinyan for his handling of the conflict. Do you think that this could be something that may, if not derail, then at least slow down the process of EU accession?
So first of all, you actually touched upon a very important point, is that Armenia's decision back in 2013 to forego the DCFTA, so the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement with the EU and Association Agreement, in favor of joining the Eurasian Union, was actually explicitly framed to the Armenian public by the then President Serge Sarkisyan as being the result of guarantees by Moscow that Russia would protect not only the territory of the Republic of Armenia, which it has treaty obligations to protect already, but would also protect Nagorno-Karabakh. And that was literally the main reason Armenia joined the Eurasian Union, because otherwise, in the run-up to these negotiations, Armenia's Prime Minister and Minister of Economy and several other experts had pointed out multiple times that Armenia's economy is too diversified and too different from that of the other Eurasian Union member states to join, and it made no sense for us to be part of it. The only reason Armenia agreed to it was the explicit security guarantees, which turned out to not exist. Unfortunately, it was tested in real life. So definitely that is something that plays into Armenia's decision-making process right now when it comes to EU membership. The EU membership doesn't come with explicit security guarantees in a military sense, but it comes with another type of guarantee. Therefore, I think for many in Armenia, this decision could be seen as a sort of like a silver lining. You know, they lost Nagorno-Karabakh in part because of Russian intransigence. EU membership could be seen as the consolation prize in some way, even to those who would be less excited about the prospects of EU membership. That said, of course, solving actually the border issue with Azerbaijan currently becomes now an EU priority as well as an Armenian priority. So it doesn't so much drag the process. Keep in mind, Cyprus joined the EU despite the fact that a third of its island is currently being occupied by Turkey. So that did not actually stop membership, but it does give Armenia a powerful ally outside of Russia to help pressure Azerbaijan into agreeing to an equitable compromise on the border situation.
And how does the newly signed agreement on strategic partnership with the United States play into all this? Because it was signed back on the 14th of January, I believe, right and before the end of Joe Biden's tenure. So the question is, do you think that this agreement will be honored by the Trump administration? And if it is, what will it change in Armenia's strategic position in the region?
So in the wider context of what we just discussed about Armenia's explicit overtures to EU membership right now, we could see this as a larger decision by Armenia to throw itself into a new geopolitical system of alliances, or at the very least, to diversify its alliance systems. That's key here because Armenia, of course, as we just mentioned, no longer sees Russia as a security guarantee given the conflict in Ukraine currently. So the strategic partnership agreement with the United States is also very noteworthy, and it really should be taken seriously because it is quite a breakthrough in Armenian foreign policy, because the way the United States looks at strategic partnership agreements is that it essentially means that Armenia is the highest form of partnership with the United States below any sort of organized structure like NATO or NAFTA or something like that. And it covers quite a lot of topics. It comes from security and defense cooperation, economic integration, diplomatic alignment, and so on. And that includes also Armenia had probably a pretty important diplomatic victory in this agreement, because it also got the United States to write down that it supports Armenia's territorial integrity. It supports Armenia's vision for a peace agreement with Azerbaijan, which includes opening of all transit links rather than what the Azerbaijanis are trying to do, which is to basically grab an extraterritorial corridor. So it gets the United States to commit to a peace agreement on Armenia's terms. So that's very important. And it also means that the United States will be able to provide Armenia with important technology transfers, which before then would have not been allowed by the Secretary of Commerce in the United States. This includes cooperation on building a new nuclear power plant, which, as well as increasing Armenia's energy independence, is also a political move, because until then, Russia, of course, controlled Armenia's only nuclear power plant, which also happens to be the only one functioning in the region. So it is pretty strategic. It is quite important, and it shouldn't be understated, but it also shouldn't be overstated, as there are some in Armenia who think of this as being essentially NATO light, in the sense that the United States is committing itself to Armenia's defense, which is not the case. Now, you pointed out the date at which this agreement was signed, which was January 14th, a mere 6 days before the Trump administration took office. There is some debate in Armenia as to whether or not this treaty was actually delayed purposely so that the Trump administration, or rather the incoming Trump administration, would sign off on it, therefore meaning that there would be continuation in policy between two administrations in the U.S. concerning Armenia, or whether they rushed it to ensure that it was signed by Biden while he still could. This obviously is the fruit of many years of Armenian diplomatic labor over the last 4 years of the Biden administration. We know, for example, that the new Secretary of State in the United States, Marco Rubio, has always been a friend of Armenia. He has pushed for Armenian genocide recognition in the past and has continued to be a vocal supporter of Armenia. So there is likely to be a continuation in relations. One thing to point out here is that the United States also had a strategic partnership agreement with the Georgians, which is Armenia's neighboring state, which has actually been suspended as of last year following Georgia's lack of commitment to its democratic transition. But interestingly enough, following the signing of this agreement, the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, stated that he was also interested in signing a similar agreement under President Trump. Now, if this agreement, of course, is not that important, then why would the Azeris suddenly be interested?
So perhaps this is also a sign of how Russia's influence is continuing to wane in the region, which is perhaps a topic worth discussing at a future opportunity. Meanwhile, Rafi Elliott was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has approved a plan to restructure his country's military. The move is meant to modernize the Ukrainian army and make it more efficient in achieving the leadership's priorities.
According to the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky, reforming the army structure and shifting to a corps-based system is one of the Ukrainian command's top priorities. The president says that the new corps commanders should be among Ukraine's best trained, most promising officers who have both plenty of combat experience and the ability to utilize modern strategies on the battlefield. The Ukrainian head of state has also promised to make relevant decisions concerning the organizational restructure available to the public. The changes are meant to make the country's armed forces stronger, as some Ukrainian units have found themselves heavily outnumbered by the Russians on several parts of the front. Russia has also recently been making progress in eastern Ukraine while simultaneously absorbing heavy losses.
US President Donald Trump has said that he would like to reach an agreement with Ukraine concerning Kyiv trading rare earth metals in exchange for aid. The deal would also include key resources that are used in electronics.
Volodymyr Zelensky already floated a similar idea back in October 2024 as part of his victory plan for the war. One element of this plan would involve securing the protection of Ukraine's natural resources, including vital metals mined in Ukraine worth trillions of dollars. Kyiv would want to encourage its Western partners to secure a joint agreement to not only safeguard valuable resources in the country, but also a joint venture for the use of their economic potential. The question of further aid for Ukraine has been shaky in the light of Donald Trump's return to the White House. The new administration has already frozen foreign aid for 90 days. The move is meant to give it time to review the aid and make sure that it aligns with policy.
The Georgian Dream Party is reportedly continuing its brutal crackdown on protests in the country's capital. Georgian authorities are said to have arrested several opposition figures during recent anti-government protests.
The European Union has condemned the latest crackdown on the protests that have been ongoing for weeks in Georgia. The EU's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, has called the quote brutal crackdown on peaceful protesters, journalists and politicians unacceptable. One of the detained protesters, Nika Melia, who is a leader of the opposition Coalition for Change, says she was released, but that she was subject to physical violence at the hands of the police. According to her, at least 25 other people were arrested during day protests, and she was not the only one who suffered physical violence. One of Tbilisi's former mayors is also among those arrested. This is not the first time that Georgian protesters say they have been mistreated by the police. Georgia's ties with the United States and European Union have become tense in the wake of the Georgian Dream's response to the situation.
Turkmenistan's government has a very unique way of determining whether pensioners receive funds. Twice a year, the country's elderly must prove that they still exist or be left without money.
Since 2018, Turkmenistan's pensioners have been scrambling to provide the government with documents proving that they are still alive. Those who do not confirm the fact that they still exist will not have their pensions processed. Anonymous Turkmenistan officials have told Radio Free Europe that this law is in place to ensure that relatives of deceased persons do not keep on withdrawing their pensions. This money is usually transferred onto plastic cards. Reports have been unable to verify how widespread the problem is. Nevertheless, for the country's senior citizens, the need to submit documents twice a year is quite troublesome. Apparently, the government changes the process quite often and does not always let people know that adjustments have been made. One example involves visiting a doctor in 3 different government offices, all in a very specific order. The country is also facing a currency problem, as some of the pension money is given out in ruined bills, which aren't always accepted by shops and traders.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.